Everyone, welcome to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and today I have with me Chad Macias, who is a cancer researcher and specifically, and actually in addition to being a cancer researcher, he's got a pretty diverse set of areas of expertise. Cancer researcher / sports nutrition expert and trainer, and actually works with a lot of elite athletes, for example, elite MMA athletes in the UFC. He is currently pursuing postgraduate research in molecular oncology. He spent over 19 years conducting research and developing protocols in cellular and molecular physiology. He's adjunct faculty at the University of San Diego, and he's also a faculty member at the University of Western States Functional Medicine and Nutrition program. And he's developed some of the most advanced blood lactate testing and intermittent hypoxia protocols in the world. He founded the Institute for Human Kinetics in 2011, where he works with many of the world's top athletes. In addition, he was a two-sport Olympic athlete. He also serves as the human performance specialist at Navy Special Warfare, developing programs to prepare Navy SEALs for combat deployment through their tactical athlete program. And he heads OPIs. That is the, wait, did we mention what OPI is, Chad?
I don't think so.
Okay, what is OPI?
It's a biomedical research group.
Okay, he heads OPI's research team and has the knowledge base to conduct medical and exercise physiology research in both humans and rodents. In this podcast, we're going to be talking entirely about cancer and your research around that. So welcome to the show, Chad. Such a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, man. Thanks we could actually get together. It's been a while, long time planning, so I appreciate you having me on. Yeah,
really a pleasure to have you. I want to start off with like big picture, totally zoomed out, the broad 30,000 foot view of cancer and why we now have a cancer epidemic, why rates of cancer, of many different kinds of cancer are increasing. Having said that, there's lots of specific cancers that arise for different reasons and different combinations of genetic and environmental factors. What is your sort of paradigm of this broad landscape of the causes of cancer, if you can treat that as sort of a broad topic without, getting too diverted by the specifics that some cancers may arise for other reasons?
Well, it's a bit of the golden question. The etiology of cancer is pretty hotly debated amongst researchers. The somatic mutation hypothesis is what's currently favored. I personally believe that there's some version of that will be accurate. And it's just in the sense that majority of all cancers arise from random DNA replication errors, and they can arise from the various things that you stated. And I think that with the changes in obesity, that would be the direct pressure that you would see rates of cancer increasing in different types of cancers that may not have been as prevalent in, say, the last 50 years. Outside of that, there really hasn't been much change. And in fact, the survivability from cancer has significantly improved over the last 25 years. So I think we're on the right path in terms of heading towards cures, especially with immunotherapy. But I think isolating more specifically the causes behind the random replication errors has proved to be very difficult. I personally believe nutrition plays a larger role than has been given credit for. And as we know, there's some obvious low-level inflammation that can come with different types of foods. And I think that really simply in and of itself would contribute significantly to a lot of the undiscovered causes of those random mutations. I believe will eventually be traced to something to that extent. But
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I want to dig into a few aspects of what you said here. One is you use the phrase random mutations, and I know that's kind of how it's spoken about in terms of the literature. Yet you also mentioned nutrition, but you also mentioned obesity, which is obviously tied into nutrition. If obesity is increasing the rates of these mutations, how can we call them random? I mean, can't we reasonably say that these mutations are being increased as a result of, for example, obesity or poor nutrition?
I'm sure it's probably possible. There's probably a way to run some type of regressional analysis. It's very difficult to do association type of research when the population has already been exposed to the variables that they may or may not be exposed to run that statistics properly. But I think more you have to look at more that the random replication errors which already happen in general, and I think it's difficult to try to separate where those errors may increase or decrease when we can't study them actively. And so it's probably a link that you will have a lot of indicators is there, but not one you'll find a smoking gun for. And I think that'll reveal itself as science and as research gets better at looking at these things over the next 3 to 5 years. I believe the answer to your question will be yes. But right now we just don't have enough data, enough inputs to ask the right question.
Okay. What about, I mean, just the very fact that cancer rates for so many different types of cancers have increased, rates of childhood cancers have increased. I'm under the impression that they've really skyrocketed. How can we talk about these things as random DNA mutations when our genes aren't changing over the last, let's say, 50 or 70 years? So why, if our genes aren't changing, why is the rate of DNA mutations changing?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I think you would have to look at each one of those inputs along with obesity, along with exposure to various different chemicals that we live around, exposure to different types of Wi-Fi with 5G, and all these different factors certainly all contribute in a different way to those errors and replication that we see. Mm-hmm. So I think in that regard, it's very difficult to find a way to do regressional analysis with all that included, and even point to even 2 or 3 of them, because each one of them has such a strong input in various different cancers. So, you might have, say, Wi-Fi, heavily influenced Wi-Fi cancers will have a totally different input than, say, heavily influenced nutritional cancers, like cancers of the digestive tract and bowel cancers, for example, that are heavily influenced by nutrition. Probably the most influenced by nutrition is, like, say, bowel cancers, where you have, very little protection against all the things that we put through our body down there. So,
gotcha.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of different tangents I want to go on here, but basically what you're saying, I think, if I can translate it, is from your perspective, like as a probably on an individual level, you would probably you're probably under the belief that it's very likely that it will ultimately be found that there's lots of environmental contributors to these DNA mutations. But speaking purely as an academic, as a researcher, as of the current science, as of 2019, we don't have like super conclusive evidence from randomized controlled trials where they followed people for 30 years and found that, put 2 different groups of people on different diets for 30 years and found that, group A has a 200% increased risk of cancer. And therefore we can attribute that precisely to these particular dietary variables.
Right. It's hard. It really is hard with so many different types of cancers that are influenced through different factors. And I think it's only becoming more complex because our world is becoming more complex and technology is becoming more complex, and all the inputs and stressors and challenges to hormetic balance that our body goes through are all increasing in both volume and type. And I think, like anything else, we're seeing times we haven't seen before where we're able to treat cancer better, but I don't think we're any closer to understanding how or why it's starting to show up in different ways and more often in certain populations, like you suggested. To be quite honest with you, I completely avoid even thinking about the childhood cancer things. I can't even have a thought about it without tearing up, man. It's too hard for me. And I commend the people that study it. Eventually, when I'm done working in the area I'm working with, I'll go over there if problem solvers are needed. But man, you're right, it's been increasing there, pretty significantly and very for pretty much every single cancer besides brain cancer. So
Yeah.
pretty alarming.
Yeah. Now, are you familiar with any research that has looked at the role of mitochondria and mitochondrial dysfunction in the context of cancer development? And are you, what do you perceive of that research as far as the role of mitochondria in the process of development of oncogenesis, of tumor formation?
Well, I suppose that dysfunctional mitochondria could lead to a growth and there could be a crazy mitosis there, and you could see something that becomes malignant. I don't see mitochondrial dysfunction being a large catalyst to create a tumor, because it just doesn't have a lot of, like, I can't, in my head as I'm trying to think, I can't draw a picture of how that would get from point A to point B. So the plausibility of it turning into a cancer, and angiogenesis and all these things that need to take place, rapid proliferation, to lead for tumorigenesis, it's possible. Certainly, the body is one of those things where you can never say this will never happen, because the second you do, it happens. So, but it's not very plausible to think that would lead, because if that was the case, I would think that cancer would be much higher in those with obesity and metabolic dysfunction that are, diabetics and granted, they do have higher rates, but I would think that it would be, it would probably be 30 or 40% higher than what we're seeing right now, if that was a thing, because there is mitochondrial dysfunction across the board in those. Same with like maybe endurance runners, because they're basically lean diabetics, professional endurance runners. What they do with their bodies and the amount of carbohydrate they take in, that's about as unhealthy as you can get in terms of metabolic function and metabolic flexibility, so to speak. Despite it being great for performance, I think you would also see them in populations like that if that was a thing. So,
gotcha. I think the main argument, as I understand it, and I recently interviewed Nasha Winters on the podcast, and the argument that her paradigm is very mitochondria centric, and I think the crux of it is basically that mitochondria are critical in sensing what's going on in the cell and determining when the cell undergoes apoptosis and programmed cell death. And if the mitochondria are not functioning well, then they're not going to basically create that programmed cell death and kill off the cell when there's enough mutations have occurred. And if that cell does not sort of commit suicide, then it can divide uncontrollably.
Well, in order for that to be true, the mitochondria would have to exist independent of the body, because you have multiple genes, P53, you have specific cancer genes that are activated to fight cancer that are completely independent of the mitochondria. You have the immune system, which also is there to fight cancer, which is completely independent of mitochondria. So that doesn't make a lot of sense, because the mitochondria is not responsible. Its job is not to fight cancer. There's a multitude of genes and systems that are responsible for detecting and fighting it. And cancer is very cunning. What I would say is that the mitochondria would play a key role in helping cancerous cells that are already cancerous evade detection and continue their processes. It would play a central role there for sure, but in isolation, it really is not relevant in the hierarchy of what's happening and why, leading to rapid proliferation, angiogenesis, and the cascade that leads for a cell to become cancerous. So that's not something that you would see.
Okay, so you mentioned nutrition, you mentioned obesity, you've even brought up like electromagnetic fields from Wi-Fi or 5G and things like that. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, at the mechanism level, how do you see these different kinds of forces converging at the cell level to initiate cancer development?
I think the most simplistic would be just changes on epigenetics and gene expression. And once once you have a slight change in gene expression on mitosis, that's all that it takes. And from there, cancer, once a cell becomes cancerous, it already has the ability to communicate and facilitate all of the needs that it can, in order to facilitate angiogenesis and to generate cancer stem cells and a tumor microenvironment and all those things that it needs to intravasate into, like, say, to circulation or into the lymph nodes and things of that nature. So
Gotcha.
It's just going to set the ball rolling, and once the ball's rolling and you've got a cell that's out of control, it already has everything that it needs right at its fingertips to do what it needs to do.
Okay. I want to dig into, I'm actually, to be honest, kind of a little surprised that you brought up the EMFs and Wi-Fi issue and 5G and things like that. I'm curious, do you actually think that's a big factor? And what, because, you know, and I actually don't have a strong position either way on this. I'm kind of open to it, and I feel like we don't know enough yet.
Sure.
And there isn't a strong consensus in the science about it. I've seen research that definitely suggests harm, and then there's other research that kind of suggests it's benign. What's your take on EMFs?
I agree with everything you just said on your kind of personal stance on it. I don't think we know enough yet, but I think there's definitely a red flag, and there's reason for alarm and reason to take a closer look at it. I think a lot of the areas that are controversial in cancer research, I have a much different perspective than most people. And it's because I'm able to actually go in and look at, you know, some of the data that was used for aspartame, the rodent data that was used to suggest that it's safe for human consumption is not what a lot of people would think it is if you actually look at the studies and you understand that you don't terminate rodents before the end of an experiment and then draw conclusions from it. So I think knowing what I know now about how science is conducted and how you can be disillusioned to think that there's going to be honesty in how experiments are conducted, industry experiments, I am highly skeptical of everything that is has a cancer-causing potential that is so broad. So I agree with you that the evidence is not there to draw those kind of conclusions yet, but I'm very cautious about it. If I could avoid exposing my family to it, I certainly would.
Yeah.
If that means anything, you know. So
yeah, I'm with you. I have wired internet in my house. I don't have Wi-Fi for that reason. Not because I'm like, I think EMFs are the most terrible thing in the world, and I'm convinced from the science that they're awful and a huge contributor to disease, but basically just because I think they might be a contributor to disease, and I think it's smart to operate based on the precautionary principle and just make some simple changes that you just make them once and then you never even think about them again.
Agreed. Yeah, I'm on a wired internet now too, partly because Wi-Fi is horrible where I'm at in unincorporated San Diego, but yeah, also for that same reason. Yeah, little small changes that are not much of an inconvenience. You know, it's especially non-nutritional changes. Nutritional changes are difficult even for people who are disciplined. You know, adherence is very hard if you don't like what you're eating. So, but stuff like this is very easy to do.
Yeah. You mentioned the word hormesis very much in passing a minute ago. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you see the lack of hormetic stressors, for example, things like exercise, things like fasting, exposures to heat and cold, you know, as opposed to being in indoor climate controlled environments. You've also, you know, in your bio, you've done hypoxia protocols, which is another form of hormesis. Interestingly enough, I know you used it more with training for athletes, but you have quite a bit of experience with that. I'm just curious if you believe that the lack of exposure to hormetic stressors in terms of the modern lifestyle is a factor in cancer development.
I don't know that it would be a factor in development. I think if you were going to develop it, you would develop it either way. I think for the cancers that are age and lifestyle related, I think it makes you way more resistant to those cancers. To the cancers that aren't related to just age or lifestyle, like, you know, obesity or smoking, things of that nature, I think the other cancers that originate from you know, hereditary or other causes, I don't believe would be impacted by those things necessarily. But certainly, I mean, that would cover a majority of the cancers out there you would be more resistant to if you had those type of stressors, especially, as we're learning more about how light affects cells and heavy water and deuterium and all of these things that science is starting to reveal to us. I think it's become way more clear that these stressors, when you include them, lead to much better cellular health, and especially mitochondrial cellular health, I think is one of the things that you find. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, so one of the things you just mentioned there that is this distinction between resistant to cancer versus the development of cancer. So can you explain that distinction a little more clearly? You're saying these hormetic stressors wouldn't necessarily prevent the formation of it, but they would make you more resistant to it.
Well,
what do you mean?
For example, when you're looking at like something like, say, telomere length and things of the nature that age has a heavy effect on. And I think that you're more resistant to certain types of cancers as those things start to play out in your life. And if you are good about exercising, exposing yourself to different types of light and grounding and different types of waters and all these different things and resisting, blue light and do different stuff at different times of the day and all these different things that you can learn about. I think all those things, when you combine them together, will make you much more resistant long-term to those cancers that are going to be predicated on, seeing a change in how resistant we are to those types of cancers that are more, that you don't really see in young people and that you don't see in people who are not obese. There's certain types of cancers that are going to be way more resisted and they may not be initiated because you would see those types of cancers in anybody once you reach a certain age, a lot of those cancers, but that's age related when our cellular health is at such a minimal, our brain capacity, all these things change. So I think during the course of getting to that point, you are much more resistant to it if you adhere to the things that we know are beneficial from those stressors.
Yeah, gotcha. I'm curious about the role of circadian rhythm and sleep. We know that sleep, for example, directly contributes to DNA damage. There's a bunch of circadian rhythm research looking at, certainly artificial light exposure at night and suppression of melatonin, and there's links between melatonin and fighting cancer. Mm-hmm. And then there's also this link with like autophagy and the feeding and fasting windows. For example, there's some research linking longer feeding windows to increase risk of breast cancer in women and things like that. So I'm curious about how light and meal timing might relate to circadian rhythm and how that might affect pathways like melatonin and autophagy or other pathways that could impact on cancer development. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that that's all incredibly complex because you're converging multiple different areas of science and medicine.
I like doing that. That's my favorite.
Yeah, that's actually that's more difficult than studying cancer, to be quite honest with you, because there's such a broad effect in terms of health that there's so many different things that it impacts in terms of disease. I think what is clear is the end result of a lack of appropriate sleep and or people who work through the night. I think the data is quite clear on mortality, comorbidities, early death, cancers. All of those things are way higher than the general population. In night workers, specifically like nurses are studied a lot in the literature, things like that. I can think about offhand a few papers like that. So I think it's clear what it leads to. And again, I think those things you don't see in people who are young unless you see something really off like that. Mm-hmm. Somebody who works through the night consistently over a 3 or 5 year period, you've probably shortened your life by 20 years by doing that, as if you were to live it any other way like you were now, but didn't work through the night. So mm-hmm. Certainly I couldn't give you specifics on I could parse out the details and we can go in the weeds for sure. But it's very clear that the end result, when you don't do those things appropriately, just simply not getting sleep right or sleeping during the window that was best intended for us, then there's some pretty dire consequences that go along with it.
Yeah. I just want to point something out, and I almost want to have you clarify it, because the initial question I asked you at the start of this podcast was sort of like, what do you perceive to be the causes of cancer? And it was the way I interpreted your initial response was almost like the environmental causes don't matter and have no impact. It's just random DNA mutations, which I know there's some segment of researchers who kind of hold that opinion. I personally think it's going to turn out to be wildly wrong.
Okay.
Then, we've dug into all these other specific subtopics, and I hear you basically saying, yeah, this could have a role in cancer development. Yeah, that probably does. Yeah, that probably does. And so you're now painting a picture that's definitely not just random DNA mutations that are occurring just based on genetics without any influence from environment.
Well, no. So they're all random DNA replication errors. So the three causes of cancer, they're parsed out into an actual percentage. I'll send you there's a good research paper on this. I can send you afterwards. Okay. So whether it's environmental,
we'll link to it on the podcast page to this episode, which I'll put under your name actually. So theenergyblueprint.com/Chad-Macias.
Yes. And I'll also be sending you about 40 papers once we dig deeper into like say specifically ketogenic diets and cancer and glioblastoma. I'll send you about 40 papers for all the things I'm talking about. But the three main causes of cancer would be hereditary, environmental, so regardless of what three you're dealing with in terms of the different causes, they all lead to random replication errors though. So it regardless of what causes the random replication error, whether it's hereditary, whether it's environmental, or whether it's something like say a heavily nutrition influence, because nutrition is doesn't really fall under environmental. So
it doesn't? What does it fall under?
Well, it does, but it doesn't, because we can't quantify it if we just look at it in that simplistic term. So it would in a broad sense, but environmental would be something like lung cancer, right? So lung cancer is going to be, that's going to be about 97% environmental. So that's more like a lifestyle related than you would consider it to be environmental, just depending on the paper, the journal. Like they all kind of use different terminology, but when we say environmental, for me, you're not talking about nutrition. Okay. So between those three inputs, they all lead to random replication errors from DNA, which already happens independently of cancer, right? We have random replication errors within all of our cells, thousands of them at a time. It's when they become excessive in certain areas, that's when you can lead to an aberrant growth in mitosis and cancer.
So I think I'm just getting hung up on the semantics of it, referring to it as random errors.
Right.
It almost suggests that paradigm that I mentioned before that some people hold, that it's like these things they're not related to nutrition and lifestyle factors. They're just purely genetic and random.
Sure.
And so I think it's just that phrase, but the picture that you're painting, the paradigm you actually hold, is one of, yes, there's very clear environmental and lifestyle factors that do influence the rate of these random errors occurring. Is that accurate?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Because when you look at something, for example, like childhood cancers, right? How could environmental things affect children and cause cancers, but we're not affected that way as adults? And very, there's a lot of childhood cancers that you can't explain through lifestyle related. They haven't been obese. They've hardly been alive. They're 3-4 years old and getting cancer. So certainly there are a lot of people who do exactly what you're talking about, that will say, oh, cancer is a purely genetic thing. That doesn't even make any sense. Like what does smoking have to do with genetics? Clearly smoking causes cancer, right? So no, for sure. Yeah, no, it's not to get hung up on those certain terms, but yes, they're all leading to random replication errors in cell division and things of that nature, even though they have a direct input in that. But there's already replication errors happening. So I think that's why they're referenced as random replication errors, because they're already happening to begin with. Those things aren't creating them. They're just influencing them in a different way.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying. That makes a lot more sense to me now. I was like trying to make sense of what your actual paradigm is for a while there, because I know you know a lot about nutrition and lifestyle factors, and I'm like, really? Does he really not think they're any significant factor in cancer?
I wish it was like that, but no, unfortunately, they all have an influence.
Yeah. So I want to go on one more little sort of digression before we get into like the metabolic theory of cancer and keto and all that sort of stuff. And this is something you brought up in passing. You mentioned how light affects cells and deuterium depleted water, which are cutting edge stuff. Obviously, I've written a book on red light therapy. Light.
Yes.
My next book is going to be on light more broadly. So I'm super geeky on the science around that topic. I'm curious what you found in relationship to light. How does that figure into all this?
Well, so the best that I can tell and its link with deuterium and deuterium accumulation is that it appears that exposure to different types of light, specifically sunlight at specific times of the day, can potentially prevent deuterium accumulation in the cells, or it can inhibit the normal deuterium accumulation in cells. And deuterium accumulates in the cells as one of the ways is as a result of carbohydrate ingestion, which really creates a challenge for me in knowing that, because I love carbs, man. I'm like a fat kid in an athlete's body, you know, so I can just carb up all day long. I love carbs, you know. I can also eat keto and I enjoy it, but it's just one of those things where I can do that when it's related to a goal that's like sports oriented or something of that nature. I don't have any problem being disciplined, but by all means I love carbs. So, but yeah, so with the way that deuterium is going to accumulate in the cells, just based on the way most people eat, it appears that has value in kind of reducing the deuterium accumulation. And the reason that's important is that it appears we have enough literature to at least entertain the idea that deuterium accumulation in the cell can also affect growth signaling. And
real, sorry to interrupt, but real quick, let's assume 95% of listeners don't know what deuterium is. So can you just kind of quickly explain that and then go follow up on where you were headed there?
Yeah. Do you think people are familiar with like heavy water and light water and those sort of concepts?
Probably not. No.
Man, that requires going into the weeds there a little
I mean,
bit.
I before the whole deuterium stuff came around in health, I had only heard of heavy water in the context of like, I think Nazi Germany. I remember seeing like history shows where they were working on like heavy water related stuff.
Sure.
And it was part of like the weapons manufacturing in Nazi Germany. That's the link in my mind. But outside of that, I knew nothing about it until this whole health craze.
Right. Well, so what I'm very not good at, I'd have to tell you, Ari, is creating layman's versions of stuff. And I think I would fail poorly if I tried to give you a layman's way to give that to the listeners. So I think it's best described as what it is. It's essentially kind of like a quantum biochemistry, if you will. If you had to classify it, it would be quantum biochemistry. And it's how can we make it simple? It will definitely just be the weight of the water within our cells, I think would be the easiest way to put that without getting crazy into the weeds. And that can have an influence over how our cells signal to grow and create new cells, so mitosis. And deuterium can accumulate, and that water and the weight of that water can be influenced by nutrition, by sleep patterns, and by exposure to light, and there's probably other things that just haven't been researched yet. So I think just looking at it from that perspective for the listeners, that's how light can influence the way that water is accumulated within our cells, within the mitochondria, if you will. And so
and how does the deuterium figure into cancer development?
So I don't know that it would influence the development of cancer. Certainly it could play a prominent role there in terms of rapid proliferation and getting that biomass started. I think what the bigger concern would be about things that we could say now is that if you already have cancer, then certainly you don't want to influence something that leads to cell division, because that's the very definition of a rapid growing tumor and how it can affect the body and then metastasize. So I think for somebody that already has cancer, you want to look at doing anything that can deplete deuterium from the cells. So deuterium depleted water is one way to do that. Also, the way that you can be influenced by sunlight, especially like in the morning, for example, is one thing that you can use to kind of influence the deuterium content of the cells. So
just to be clear, this deuterium depleted water is water that you can drink that has been taken through a process to get rid of the deuterium.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And there's research actually to show that that's beneficial on cancer outcomes.
Oh, brother, yes, it's impressive. There's actually phase 2 clinical trials where they use deuterium depleted water to improve progression-free survival in terminal cancer by years.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, I've been contacted by NASA and talked to them a couple times because they're concerned about radiation exposure when the astronauts go to Mars. They're concerned that the radiation exposure will lead to almost immediate cancer.
Wow.
And so we had discussions about things that they could do to try to combat that. And that's one of the things I suggested, like, hey, have them drinking deuterium depleted water for a couple months before they go up there. And, let's try to look at every little thing that could potentially create a problem for growth signaling if there was a cancer scenario. So, deuterium depleted water is available commercially. People can also make it at home. I think
make it at home. Oh, I haven't heard that. Tell me about that.
So here's the thing about that though. So for it to be therapeutic in the cancer trials, it has to be a specific parts per million. I think it's somewhere around 120. I can't remember directly off the top of my head. I believe it's right around 120, but I don't know offhand how you would secure that making it at home. But yes, to make it at home, there's all kinds of YouTube videos on it. It's really, really easy to Google search, but you basically just freeze water. As it starts to freeze and it builds up the layer on the top, you scrape it all off and then repeat the process. Eventually what you're left with is deuterium depleted water. So
the deuterium, for whatever reason, the deuterium, the heavy water that's deuterium rich has a lower freezing point.
Yes. And so it'll accumulate and it will enable you to kind of clear it out to where you'll end up with some deuterium depleted water. So I think it's maybe I misspoke there. It's a higher temperature. Lower
implies like lower temperature, but
lower, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
So
what I meant, though.
I don't know how you would ensure, Ari, that you got that parts per million correct.
Right.
But certainly, if cost is an issue, or somebody that just wanted to just kind of do it as a preventative maintenance precautionary. I think it would be simple to just do that at home and make your own. But they do have it available commercially as well. But there's probably, I want to say, about 6 to 8 phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials where it's been used to improve progression-free survival.
Wow.
So for me, that's pretty powerful. It doesn't get any better than that. It looks like it's a scalable thing based on the clinical trials results and the fact that they already made it through phase 2. So
interesting.
pretty cool stuff.
Yeah. I'm curious if there's anything known about, for example, like tap water, city water coming out of your tap versus like spring water versus glacial water as far as deuterium content in those different waters. Do you know anything about that?
I've read about it. The glacier water is a better source for less deuterium. I don't know much about other water sources other than that. I mean, I've seen that factoid in reading about it, that's a better source of deuterium depleted water if you were just to list out what each type of water had in it existing. But I don't know much about other water sources in terms of their deuterium content, to be quite honest with you.
Well, it sounds like, it sounds like sunlight, which I'm a huge fan of and is a big part of my recommendations in what I teach people. It sounds like that in and of itself will probably turn out to be a really powerful way to create deuterium depleted water inside your cells, which is probably ultimately where it really matters the most.
Yeah, it seems like it. And I think the more that we get people who are interested in studying this, because it's difficult to get something like that into a clinical trial, depending on its clinical utility. But it appears that it does have good clinical utility. And it's one of those things where I would love to see it thrown into as an adjunct into standard care into a cancer trial, because why not? You throw exercise, you throw all these other things in there to try to make a difference, especially in terminal cancer, right? Where the battleground is really at. And so, yeah, I see it being something of great value moving forward in oncology treatment as the oncology world starts to embrace that there's other things out there that we can use, off-label drugs. There's all these other things now that researchers are going, wow, this stuff there's other things that we can do outside of, cut, burn, and radiation. So
yeah,
I definitely see that being something that we see here very shortly, because it's already in play now.
Yeah, awesome. This is fascinating stuff. So I want to get into the metabolic theory of cancer. and keto diets. So this has been written about by a few different people in recent years, and kind of popularized this notion that, for example, cancer feeds on sugar, but not fat or ketones. And so if you go on a keto diet, it kind of starves the cancer,
Sure.
or reprograms the metabolism in a way that fights cancer. What I know that you're pretty critical of some aspects of this. So why are you critical of this theory? What's wrong with it?
So there's a lot wrong with it, actually. It's pretty interesting to see how far this has come based off of what I could only describe as, like, say, bad science, is really what it comes down to. And I became really interested in this because it just became something I was very curious about. And cancer is always something I've wanted to study. My family's been affected by it. Most families have. My mom and aunt both had breast cancer. It's affected my wife as well. And so, I kind of thought, well, maybe I can look at what's going on here. I'm a good thinker. Maybe I can help out here. I wouldn't mind getting some education in this and seeing what I can do. I've done a lot in the other fields I've worked in. So that's what kind of pushed me down that path, and was naturally guided to the keto for cancer discussion because it's so prevalent amongst the lay and social media. And then also in the research world, there's probably 400, review papers on the ketogenic diet and cancer. And all 400 of them have specifically looked at rodent and cell culture data. So to get to where we are now, let me go back to the beginning so that people can understand really why I've been so critical, because there's been a lot of very strong claims made about what the ketogenic diet can do for cancer, and none of them are supported by any evidence in humans whatsoever. Not one of those claims. And so when you're making those kind of claims, and you and I both know that when they get filtered down to the layman, to the average person, what was said has been so diluted to begin with. And if it's not based on accurate science, that's pretty dangerous. And so you can go into any chat room anywhere in any kind of social media, Instagram, Facebook, whatever it is, and you can find people giving each other advice on how to use the ketogenic diet to treat a family member or themselves with cancer. And that really is what kind of pushed me to say, well, no, hold on a second here. Let's take a look at what's going on, because if that's the case, why isn't that reflected in clinical trials? And so when I look back to where this all started, around early 2000, you started seeing series of cell culture papers being published that were looking at specifically glioblastoma. If I can remember correctly, I would believe it's the U87 cell line, which was and still is pretty popular in studying glioblastoma. And so what researchers were doing is they were allowing these glioblastoma brain cancer cells to adapt to the serum in the cell culture in that petri dish. And then they were investigating how they responded to glucose and fatty acids and protein. And so they conducted these experiments, and they're noticing, they're like, wow, it really has an affinity for glucose and doesn't respond to fatty acids. And so, they continued doing more experiments, and this led to rodent studies. And that's pretty much where it stopped. And then the hysteria started. And then you had a lot of people who were fringe researchers in terms of they're not oncologists and they're not medical doctors, right? So they don't actually study cancer and they don't actually treat patients, but they're studying ketogenic diets in rodents. And that's where a majority of where this sensation that you see now on social media was started from, was a group of researchers who are what I would consider fringe in terms of cancer research, all well-qualified, highly educated PhDs in biochemistry, and even some doctors that are non-oncologists, but they're studying oncology and they're not working with human patients, and they're drawing a lot of conclusions from their work, and it influenced everybody, and it got really out of control. And so in looking at the clinical trials, I want to be at the forefront in the battleground of studying this. So I said, I need to go get an education in cancer biology, which is where I'm still currently doing that. I'm still working towards my PhD in molecular oncology at San Luis Rey University in Spain. Started with my master's in molecular oncology at Central Institute for Biomedical Studies, also in Spain, which is the leading research facility for cancer researcher in the world. And I started asking questions. And when I looked at the clinical trials, which does exist in human patients and ketogenic diets, it's not improving progression-free survival. And so why is it not improving progression-free survival there? But it does in a majority of the rodent models. Only a few of them does it not work. and in all these cell culture studies. So I started looking at the cell culture studies and to understand, well, why is this showing up here, but it doesn't show up in human patients? Obviously, there can be differences in between what happens in a petri dish and what happens in humans, but for the most part, what you see is fairly accurate of what you can loosely see biochemically within the biological individual. And so when I looked at that, you start seeing all these papers that are recommending that you do not do cancer research when you allow the cells to adapt to the serum. So they lose their ability to differentiate. They lose their ability to be clonogenic, to be tumorigenic. It changes their epigenetics. It prevents them from looking like the parent cell. So they cannot recapitulate anything that came from the actual original tumor. So it's a horrible place to examine what's going to happen with the substrate. And one thing that is very clear now when you look at cell culture studies that have specifically investigated this, and the research studies that I'll be sending you to put up on the page, I've got about 10 that specifically directly quote everything that I'm telling you, that say, do not conduct these type of experiments where you allow the cells to adapt to the serum. They lose their fatty acid oxidation potential when you do that. So they cannot oxidize fatty acids when you allow them to adapt to a serum that has glucose or bovine or any of the other typical serums that you find. You can't do it because you're going to get a picture that is incomplete where you think that they cannot use fatty acids, but they actually can, and sometimes at a higher rate.
And so this is for anybody who got lost in the biochemistry that you're describing here. What you're basically saying is, in the experimental model, you're going to draw the conclusion that these tumors are being starved on a low carb, higher fat substrate, but in an actual living human being, that would not occur, and the tumors could maybe, it sounds like, easily adapt to burning fats or ketones for fuel, and maybe even, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe even preferentially use them for fuel or something to that effect?
Both of those can be true depending on the cancer, but to continue to draw the line from there, so that's exactly right. You have these cell culture, these petri dish experiments where they left glucose in there. The cells adapted to using glucose and not fat. When they introduced fatty acids, the cells couldn't use them and they died. And so it gives this illusion that that's what's going to happen in the individual. So they take those and they go to the rodent studies. Well, the same thing happens in a lot of the rodent studies. So that is going to bring about some pretty strong confirmation bias for researchers who are looking at this going, hey, wow, look, this is happening in rodents too. So the rodent stuff will just keep very brief and very simple. Rodents have a basal metabolic rate that's 7 to 8 times higher than humans, and a vastly, I'll say it one more time, vastly different hepatic function compared to humans. It's a good model to rapidly induce obesity and look at changes in nutrition related to obesity, influence diseases, body mass, and things like that. It's a great model to do that. It's a horrible model to investigate cancer when you're investigating how a high-fat diet influences tumorigenesis. Horrible model to do that in. It is, I see more value in jumping straight from cell culture to working with non-human primate like canine or monkeys and then humans, then going to rodents, because it'll give off another illusion that you have this therapeutic intervention that you really don't have, because that environment will never exist in a human. So you get cell culture that went to rodent studies. The rodents happen to respond in a similar way that you saw in the cell culture. There's a few different reasons also that there's problems with some of the rodent data that I will briefly mention. The group of researchers that was really spearheading this, Dominic D'Agostino, Tom Seyfried, those guys popularized this with a rodent model that they created themselves, the VMM3 model of metastases. The problem with that is that it doesn't have external validation. And for the listeners, what that means is that no other scientists or groups outside of these individuals use that model to study cancer and treat cancer with a ketogenic diet in that model. So the only ones to do it, they created it. And they started conducting these experiments in rodents and started drawing conclusions into humans, saying, hey, you can use this in humans. It can be an adjunct. It might even replace chemo and radiation by itself, which is crazy to say in a research study that you conducted on rodents. And so you have both rodents being an inappropriate place to investigate a high-fat diet because of the changes in basal metabolic rate and the difference in hepatic function. And then you also have a group of researchers who are responsible for popularizing this diet and cancer intervention, who used a rodent model that didn't have external validation. So you have multiple different problems with the rodent side of the research as well.
Yeah.
So
I think I also heard, maybe I'm interrupting your flow and you were going to get here, but I think I also heard you say in another interview I listened to something to the effect of they actually miscited, they made claims in their paper where they put citations next to it, and the citations literally didn't support the claims they were making.
Yeah, so, I don't want to throw too much mud because I've tried to get to a place where I can build bridges with people, because I think we have a common goal to some extent. But certainly those research papers, there was references in there that that were unrelated to the point. It wasn't that the point was that it required a large amount of evidence. It was simply that when you started looking through some of the citations, they were like completely unrelated to what it needed to say. Mm-hmm. There was also a lot of things in the papers where they would make claims about biochemistry that, it's impossible to use fatty acids in brain cancer tumors because you don't have the metabolic phenotype, you don't have these biochemical milieu, and all of that stuff has been demonstrated to be false. It was false when they said it. There was evidence to prove it was false when they said it. It's since been solidified as false with a lot of human data. So there was a lot of problems within their papers as well that you alluded to, both with citations not being accurate and also an inaccurate description of what's actually happening within the tumor itself. Despite that they were describing what happens in rodents, they were still projecting that as that would be similar to what you would see in human patients. So if we fast forward to what happens in actual human patients, so let's go to that data. We've talked about the problems of cell culture in rodents. So what happens in actual human patients? There's actually clinical trials that have been published. A lot of people don't realize that. And I've got that data right here. So the first study that was conducted by the Institute of Neuro-Oncology Hospital at Frankfurt, it had 20 patients total, only 17 completed it. They verified ketosis through urinary measures. The researchers were looking at what we call progression-free survival and overall survival. That's what matters in cancer. Progression-free survival is how long you can survive without the tumor itself, the cancer progressing any further with the treatment. Overall survival is achieved after 5 years of no progression from the cancer at all. At the 5-year mark, that's considered overall survival. And so the researchers looked at overall survival and progression-free survival in a group of patients. They had different types of cancers. So you had glioblastoma, you had prostate, you had different types of cancers. So the medium progression-free improvement was 5 weeks. None of the patients saw a change at 6 months where they weren't progressing. So every single one of the patients had progressed by the 6-month mark. The average time before progression was about 5 weeks. So they did not achieve any significant progression-free survival in that group compared to what you would see with standard care. So the second study was with 12 patients at the Veterans Affairs Hospital here in Pittsburgh. So they had patients that had prostate melanoma, renal cell, pancreatic, colon, thyroid, head and neck, and glioblastoma, and lung cancer. 6 patients discontinued treatment at 4 weeks due to the disease progressing. 2 patients discontinued treatment at 8 weeks, 1 due to grade 3 weight loss, 1 due to disease progression. 3 patients completed the 16-week trial. 2 of those patients died, 1 at 40 weeks, 1 at 80 weeks, with 1 patient reporting disease-free at 131 weeks, which was the melanoma patient, which is that type of melanoma was not terminal, so that was not unexpected. So you can see that when we look at the clinical trials, that it has not led to any progression-free survival in the various forms of cancer that it's been investigated in.
And this, just to be clear, this was keto diets being investigated for these different types of... It was
a ketogenic diet used as what we call an adjunct to standard care. So the patients were still receiving chemo and radiation, and they were introducing the ketogenic diet to try to improve the therapy itself. From a cancer biologist perspective, you use the ketogenic diet to sensitize the tumor to keto. That's the hypothesis that's been put forward, that it will sensitize it to the treatment because it's not going to have a fuel source. What we find when we actually started studying this a little bit closer is that we actually already found the complete opposite of that. And that's what makes this so frustrating, is that the original cell cultures, not only were they conducted improperly, but it's actually the complete reverse when you do it properly. So when you actually investigate these things in cell culture, when you don't allow the tumors to adapt to the serum, and you introduce glucose or sugar, and you introduce fat, fat is the preferred fuel source for glioblastoma, for brain cancer. And one of the things that, and the thing that I wanted to understand is why are these things happening? And if there's all this data in the cell culture, and even with knowing why it's improper, you still want to find out what exactly is happening within a tumor. How could the tumor use fat? And how is it going to not be able to resist the treatment? And how does it not resist the treatment? And so in asking all those questions at the same time, I study specifically glioblastoma. Myself, Tim Sharp, and Brad Dieter are involved in a clinical trial at SUNY Upstate Medical Hospital and University in New York, where we are introducing a ketogenic diet as an adjunct for glioblastoma for brain cancer patients. So we are actually trying to figure out ways for this to work and the reasons why it doesn't work. And what that clinical trial has revealed to us is that when we start looking at the ways that a tumor can resist treatment, so why is a tumor terminal in this cancer, but it's not in another cancer? And it's actually pretty simple. It comes down to antioxidant defense. So you have chemo and you have radiation, and they're trying to disrupt the DNA that the tumor is using to regenerate all the things it needs for fuel and biochemical needs. And it's also, we're using the keto, which is trying to introduce cellular death and apoptosis. It's inducing cytotoxicity in the cell, which will lead to cell death. And the way that the tumor resists that is through antioxidant defense. So it wraps up glutathione production to resist the cytotoxicity that comes with chemo and radiation. So there's a couple of noteworthy things that happen when we start looking at that really in depth, specifically in glioblastoma, which is where ketogenic diet has been prescribed the most, is in brain cancer. So when you start looking at how do brain cells produce glutathione to resist the chemo, and we start looking at it, it's actually produced through fatty acid oxidation. So fatty acids increase the ratio of NAD plus to NADH. And anytime you increase the ratio of NAD plus to NADH, you're going to increase antioxidant production. And in fact, one of the chemotherapy drugs that's used is specifically reduces NAD so that you can reduce that ratio in the antioxidant production. So fatty acids.
Just to be clear, this process that you're talking about, I think it also involves things like sirtuins and NRF2 pathway, and
yes,
this process is profoundly beneficial to ramp this process up in normal healthy cells.
Yes.
But you're talking about when it's happening, when it's being ramped up, and these internal antioxidant defense system is being bolstered in tumor cells, that
yes,
becomes their defense against things like chemo or radiation.
Correct. And so there's a couple of kind of large indicators of what's going on that a lot of these researchers seem to ignore. And so when you look at patients who are on chemo and radiation for any type of cancer, it doesn't have to be brain cancer, one thing you notice is that regardless of the metabolic phenotype of the tumor, so some tumors do prefer to use sugar or glucose. That is true. There are tumors that will prefer to use sugar and glucose, and as they change throughout tumor progression, that changes and they go to using more proteins, or like pancreatic cancer has a upregulation of autophagy, and there's all these just random different things for each cancers. But what you start to see is that these different types of tumors resist the therapies by switching over to oxidative phosphorylation. So they all start using fatty acid as their main fuel source when you try to kill them. All of them, every one of these tumors that you find, the cells within them will start going to oxphos to fight against the stress that is created by the treatment. And the reason that it can do that is, again, because fatty acids can support glutathione production in the mitochondria and the cytosol, And it was always thought that it was glucose through the pentose phosphate pathway, that's what was happening. But in fact, that's not the case. It's actually happening through fatty acid oxidation, that it's increasing the NAD, NADH. Yeah, so basically fatty acids and ketones can increase the NAD plus to NADH ratio, which will increase glutathione production and help the tumor resist the chemo and radiation. And when I start looking at, there are survivors, which we call extreme survivors of glioblastoma, and there's a couple survivors that have utilized a ketogenic diet. So it's like, okay, so if this is the case, and I'm so sure of myself, then how did this person survive despite using a ketogenic diet? So that's where IDH1 mutation comes in. So there's different types of mutations that happen within glioblastoma. There's several, and that can actually define the type of brain tumor it is. And one of them is the IDH1, IDH2 mutation. And when we started to look at that a little bit closer, I had a feeling that we were gonna find that fatty acid oxidation is downregulated in those with the IDH1 mutation, and sure enough, it is. So in the people that have an IDH1 mutation, they don't have the ability to oxidize fatty acids to improve that NAD, NADH ratio and improve
specifically in the tumor cells or throughout all the cells?
Well, this would be specifically in the brain tumor cells.
Interesting.
And so a lot of this stuff is actually a little more specific to brain cancer in terms of like the glutathione production, and glial brain cells is really where this plays out. And it may play out in other areas. I haven't studied that in other cancers, but I have a feeling it will, not in all, but most it'll be similar in that glutathione production is better supported through fatty acids. And that's clear by the fact that all tumors switch to oxidative phosphorylation when you introduce chemo and radiation. The second you introduce chemo and radiation, a tumor that had previously been living on glucose will immediately switch over to oxidative phosphorylation and start using fatty acids as its fuel source, also as its carbon source. So tumors don't just take glucose and fatty acids for fuel. They'll break them down so they can get the carbon moiety from it, and it can take it and use it for building blocks and rapid proliferation. So that's
Gotcha.
another thing. People have a misconception that fuels that glucose and fatty acids are only a fuel source and that you can starve the tumor. They're not just used as a fuel source. And anytime you try to starve one of those fuel sources, the tumor will literally just adapt. It's such a reductionist approach that is totally ignorant of how intelligent cancer operates on. I just want to bang my head in the wall when people suggest stuff like that.
Suggest like basically that, cancer feeds on sugar, and if you eat a low carb, ketogenic diet, you're starving the cancer.
Yeah. And
like that level of reduction is what you're talking about that makes you want to bang your head against.
Yeah. That's just ridiculous. You don't think that we would be doing that as cancer researchers to help these patients live? Like, I mean, it's asinine to think that something so simplistic, we wouldn't just do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of misconceptions about what happens in cancer research, and you always hear big pharma and their influence. Big pharma is the reason why our rates of cancer death have dropped significantly. Even though chemo has its own set of problems that come along with it, it saves a ton of lives. And standard care is hands down the best way to go about it. If my children or my wife, as we are currently dealing with cancer in the family, I will highly recommend standard care across the board if immunotherapy or a really attractive clinical trial is not available. It's hands down the best way to do things. And to think that you could so simplistically do something that we wouldn't just do on our own accord. There's no big pharma doesn't fund. A majority of cancer research is just funded by the NIH or the university itself that conducts it. Big pharma puts very little money into cancer research unless it's for the drug they're developing. So, and there hasn't been very many drugs developed in the last 20 years for chemo or for radiotherapy, which is now a majority done through laser anyway. So,
gotcha. One more little digression, which is the Gerson diet and the, kind of the vegan approach to cancer. There's a little bit of a battle even among the people who think, standard care, chemo, radiation should be avoided. There's an internal battle where even within those people, there's a division where some people are more pro keto and other people are more anti keto, pro, vegan diets.
Sure.
Do you have any thoughts on that debate at all?
Yeah, sure. I do. I think that anybody arguing for the use of a ketogenic diet as an adjunct outside of a clinical trial setting doesn't know what they're talking about. We don't have any evidence in humans that this can improve progression-free survival. So I don't understand why people continue to draw conclusions from studies that are not in humans to treat humans. The human data suggests it's not effective. Okay. So I would say that is they definitely should not be voicing their opinion if that's what their opinion is, because it's not validated by evidence. So in looking at the side, the vegan or the juicing and the coffee enema side of things. So it sounds attractive, and it seems intrinsic that you could be healthier by doing those things. The problem is the evidence is just not there. I personally have investigated it. I've contacted the NIH about it. There's been research studies published on the Gerson methods. And when researchers at the NIH and other cancer biologists looked at their data independently and asked for 5-year follow-up from their cancer patients, it did not exist because they did not follow up with a single patient. So when these researchers tracked down all these patients, at 5 years, the group of 50 patients that they chose to track down, all but one was dead, and the one that was alive still had cancer and died within a year. So the evidence would suggest they're not treating cancer at all. The evidence suggests they're sloppily helping people with a method that I'm not sure that has any value. There was probably a dozen reported cases of death from their methods, from both the enemas gone wrong and also the use of raw liver led to a number of deaths here in San Diego that are all, I will happily also send those to you. All this stuff is published in peer review, which is wonderful. So there's no evidence for that. Now, with that being said, I know of a few different clinics where people that I have personally helped through the cancer journey have went where they used a combination of a Gerson-like method along with low-dose chemo and a few other natural methods with success that I verified through MRI and PET scan at an oncology hospital that's well-respected here in the U.S. So I do see value in using methods like that when they are combined with standard care. But when you have groups like the Gerson Hospital and other institutes that are using those as their standard care, I think it's a recipe for to die, and to die quickly.
Gotcha.
I don't see any value in that stuff at all.
Yeah. Do you think there's, and we spoke, we kind of alluded to some possible ones earlier, but do you think there's any natural treatments that you would wholeheartedly recommend or encourage people to look into, let's say in conjunction with standard care, whether it's fasting or
absolutely,
deuterium depleted water and things like that?
There is a ton of stuff that is heavily evidence-based that you can look at. You just mentioned a few of them. Deuterium depleted water. You can look at circadian rhythms, how sunlight affects deuterium in the cells. You can look at things that there's really strong cell culture, and dosage is probably where you might run into some problems, but things like turmeric and different types of anti-inflammatories that, depending on where you're at with cancer, because you don't want to arm the body with anti-inflammatories during chemo resistance, because that's how it resists the treatment. There's this kind of battleground there where there is value with anti-inflammatories, depending on what stage of cancer you're at and things of that nature, which is why it's good to have somebody guiding you through these journeys that has the experience. But yes,
and certainly in the context of cancer prevention, and somebody who doesn't yet have.
Yeah, and when you shift over to the prevention, yes, all those things go well with prevention. You can also take a look at things like a Mediterranean diet and things that kind of more or lower carb that would also reduce your exposure to things like deuterium. But certainly there is a whole realm of healers out there, whether it's naturopaths or functional medicine specialists, or even if you're in allopathic medicine, there's integrated medical specialists in fields now that I think has a ton of value in prevention and treatment of cancer. I think allopathic medicine by itself is pretty limited. It's, cut and burn, for cancer. And that's really all there is. I mean, they usually don't even advise cancer patients on nutrition when they are in front of the oncologist.
I've heard stories from people with cancer that literally, ask their oncologist about nutrition, and the oncologist will say, I've heard this multiple times, where the oncologist will say something like, it doesn't matter if you eat McDonald's and candy bars or whatever, organic food you want to eat, doesn't make any difference.
Yeah, that's it. There's a lot of oncologists who say that because they're lazy and don't give a crap, and it hurts me to hear that, but it's definitely true. There's also some that will say that because they want the patient to be as happy as they can be. And depending on the scenario, that actually may be the right thing, is because
if it's like a terminal cancer and you don't want somebody to suffer unnecessarily from also changing their diet.
Well, because muscle wasting becomes such an issue for cancer patients, right? I mean, you die from metastases, or you die from wasting away. You die from, so I think that a lot of times just the fact that they can eat is a plus for an oncologist. So, but that's not who you're referencing. You're not referencing the person that is concerned about their patient that just wants them to eat because they're worried about them wasting away, because that is what will kill them. Not even necessarily the tumor itself. And so I think the people that just, don't care enough to give a recommendation or to refer them out to an RD or somebody at the hospital, that's just unacceptable and completely ridiculous and far too common. And it's really unfortunate, because there's certainly nutrition has value in at least, being slightly resistant to just the therapy that you're going through. And like you mentioned, fasting, like we know that if you fast before chemotherapy, it can almost completely reduce the side effects to nothing. And that's extremely powerful. If you're an oncologist, you owe it to your patients to go to conferences and listen to people like me talk about what's in the literature and what we see, and how you can translate that over to your patients for clinical utility. And that's a great example of a tool that you can use.
And just real quick, before we started recording this podcast, you mentioned something to me as we were talking, and I said, you got to bring that up in the podcast. So you mentioned basically exactly what you were saying, is that there's a ton of oncologists who are just, they have their training from medical school, from their residency, and they kind of know what they know, but they're not necessarily keeping up with all the latest advancements from cancer researchers such as yourself. And they don't know, what's been published in many cases, and the latest science that's emerged in the last couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. That, I think it's actually a huge problem in the field of oncology, is there's a large disconnect between what we're looking at in scientific research and clinical trials, and what they have knowledge of that we're doing. And I think that they should attend these conferences where they have a general knowledge of these chemotherapy are what we prescribe for this, and we're going to use radiation or whatever protocols they have at the university or the hospital that they're at. And that's kind of a lot of times how they go at it. And I'm not trying to take a knock on anybody, but you certainly need to be aware of the ever-changing landscape. Immunotherapy will all but make me completely redundant within 10 years. And that's great news. I don't want to have a job studying cancer, because if I don't, then everybody's living, and that's great.
Yeah.
But that's where it's headed. And I think it's so foolish for them to not be aware of clinical trials, to go on to clinicaltrials.gov and do a simple search. If you're an oncologist and you treat brain cancer patients, stay up on what clinical trials are there, because maybe you can recommend your patient there if you haven't given them any rounds of chemoradiation, and there's a promising immunotherapy trial at, like, for example, here at UCSD in California, where they're pioneering that. You would want to be aware of that. That's going to give your patient the best chance to survive, and they just don't get that. And so that's one of the things that I do, is we, Tim Sharp and myself, will go around to different nutrition conferences. And in fact, University of Western States has sent us to conferences to talk about, we've created poster presentations, and we've written a letter to the editors about some of these researchers, and we present that data as to the problems and also what you can do about them, solutions. We don't just talk about what's wrong, we also talk about what the solutions are as well.
Awesome. Chad, this has been phenomenal. I've really enjoyed this. This is absolutely fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Sure.
Last thing that I want to ask from you, just real quick, if you could give, and you don't have to go in detail, but just your top 2 or 3 things that you think are the most important things, having said that this is somewhat speculative when we talk about causes of cancer, but for people who are interested in how to prevent cancer, what are your top 2 or 3 things that you'd say to somebody who says, I want to make sure that I live to do as much as possible to live to 100 without ever getting cancer?
So I would say from a nutrition perspective, consider a Mediterranean diet. It appears that that is likely the best case scenario for long-term avoidance of cancer from a nutrition perspective without creating any problems anywhere else. I think that would be what my nutrition recommendation would be. Create a type of protocol or an awareness about the small little tools that you can have in your tool bag, like dealing with blue light, like grounding and getting sunlight early in the morning, being conscious of deuterium or maybe even deuterium depleted water. That would be number 2. Number 3
So
would
I'll
be,
just translate that for everybody listening as sign up for the Energy Blueprint.
yeah, no, you're all
I'll
of
give
your work.
I'll give a little pitch for my own program where I talk in depth about those
it's
things.
totally appropriate. And if I were to recommend anybody, I would recommend you. So that's
Thank
fine.
you. That means a lot to
That's
me.
great.
Thank you.
No, your work is exactly what people should read if that's what they're curious about from the perspective of light and how light affects various different aspects of health. I'm sure you covered all of them. In reading some of it, I have seen you cover a majority of the things that I could think of off the top of my head. So yeah, certainly reading a book that can educate you on how to use light, so you're not relying upon something on social media. Go to the subject matter experts like Ari that have written these books. Look at the peer-reviewed literature also to guide you when you're doing these things. And lastly, the third thing would be just to use common sense and avoid the obvious. Don't live under power lines and then wonder why your child has some obscure rate of cancer. I mean, use common sense, which doesn't seem to be so common nowadays, but nevertheless, just avoid the obvious that is not healthy for you, because we oftentimes know things aren't in our best interest and we do them anyway. So please, that would be like not smoking, not living near power lines, trying to avoid your exposure to 5G and things of that nature.
Yeah. Beautiful. Chad, this was seriously awesome. One of my favorite podcasts. So educational. I learned a bunch of new stuff too. And really thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you also for spending a huge amount of time with me. I really appreciate it. For anybody listening who wants to either follow you, I don't know if do you work with people directly, like one-on-one? But maybe you can feel free to just let people know where they can follow your work or reach you if they want to work with you.
I mainly exist within the research realm, and then we do a lot of work with elite athletes. So I'm easily accessible though on social media, Chad Macias on Facebook. I'm on Instagram as well. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about cancer. You can send me a message, send me a friend request. I'm easily approachable. Outside of that, be looking for lots of research papers to be published, which I will put out through my social media. And then I'll leave my email address with all the research studies I sent to Ari to put up, and feel free to contact me that way.
Beautiful. Chad, thank you again. I know you got to run. Kids, I got my kids waiting for me to go for a little outdoor adventure while we still got some sunlight here in San Diego.
Yes, sir.
And I'm sure you're very busy as well. Thank you again. I look forward to more future conversations with you.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, brother. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.